Hello, everyone. Good morning. I'm now at the LaSalle Library, and this is the Poetry Festival Singapore. And I'm Daryl Lim. I'm the moderator for this morning's session. And today, I think we are going to speak about four landmark authors. So 4 poets who have published with Landmark Books, which is a literary press in Singapore. And these are myself, Ms. Heng Tian here, Jonathan, and Dr. Gwee, who can't join us today, but we'll be listening to him via video. Maybe what I'll do is I'll start off with a quick introduction of everyone, and then we'll go into Dr. Gwee's video, which will introduce his work, and then we will have a little reading among us 3 who are here on site today, and we'll do some Q&A and discussion at this time. So without further ado, maybe I'll just read out some of the bios. I'll start with Dr. Gwee first, because he's the first speaker and he will be seen via video. Gwee has 7 poetry books to date, the latest being This Floating World. He's also a comics creator who wrote and drew Singapore's first long-form graphic novel in English, Myth of the Stone. He loves to make all kinds of books, and his recent publications include Singlish translations of well-loved literary classics. Jonathan Chan is a writer and editor of poems and essays. Born in New York to a Malaysian father and South Korean mother, he was raised in Singapore and educated at Cambridge and Yale universities. He's the author of the poetry collection Going Home, which was very recently released by Landmark. He has been recently moved by the work of Lucille Clifton, Christian Wyman, and Wong May. Heng Tian has 6 poetry collections, the most recent being Grandma's Attic, Mum's HDB, My Wallpaper. She co-wrote The Adopted, Stories from Angkor, and Lost Bodies, Poems Between Portugal and Home. In 2000, she was a fellow with the Iowa International Writing Program at the University of Iowa, USA. Lastly, myself, I'm Daryl Lim. I'm a poet, translator, and literary critic. My latest book is Anything But Human, which was recently shortlisted for the Singapore Literature Prize. And yeah, welcome everyone. I think let's start off with Dr. Gwee's video. He can't join us today. He's in Korea holidaying, lucky him. And so we will listen to him first.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me to this event focused on landmark poets. Of the first era of book-length poets published by Landmark Books, I seem to be the only surviving one still with it. This I consider an honor. I have to date 7 collections with Landmark. All my poetry books are with Landmark. I am always grateful to the attention and care Gwee has given to Singaporean poetry over the decades for developing it, and really above all to be there for me. Now, for a decade from 2010 to 2020, I committed myself to a very specific project, which is to write haikus, to explore what more can be done with this form. And I created something I called haikuku, which can really be experienced strictly in the reading rather than in my explaining. But if I have to, I will say that basically I observed that in Singaporean life, there seem to be cycles. We seem to be going through a pattern, a loop of life, pretty much similar to seasons that are often the themes in haiku. But I feel that I should try to, in a sense, reduce our life for this essence. The first book that came out in relation to these haikukus is, of course, the collection called Haikuku in 2017. In it, there were 120 over haikus. This I thought represented key elements of repetition in Singaporean life. And with this floating world, I thought I could refine and get even more specific with events that I feel, are quite strangely echoey. They keep coming back one way or another. This floating world was published in 2021, last year, and they are altogether, I think, 390 over haikus, which is 3 times the size of Haikuku. It's meant to be, in that sense, structurally a joke, of course, because haiku is about saying more with fewer words, and thought I reverse it and now have more of saying fewer words that mean more, right? And so this book had to be thick, it had to be substantial for the point to be made. And I am very grateful to Heng for being able to produce this book in a relatively inexpensive edition, despite the size. So now I will read to you 10 haikus from this floating world. The crock is broken, and words are gushing out to make room for void. People with too much time are making people with too much time angry. The mystery cat reaches into his pouch. There he finds my childhood. If you run and fall, even with umbrella, you will still get wet. Ants never get lost. See how they march in line and sniff another's ass. We need people to challenge authority, say people who didn't. Milk is milk. You buy expensive milk to have smart kids, but are you smart? Words are not a will. A will is not a house. A house is not a home. Who are you in whose dream I am awake, that I cannot sleep tonight? Life is a shithole. It doesn't get better when I come out to breathe. Once again, thank you for inviting me to this reading. I hope you continue to enjoy the rest of this session. Bye. Hello. Thank you for inviting me to this event focused on landmark.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. And thank you again, Gwee, for that wonderful reading and recording. And actually, I thought I liked Gwee's video because he actually talked quite a bit about Heng and Landmark Books. So Heng is the founder of Landmark Books. And actually, Landmark Books has been in the Singapore literary scene for a long time. Is it maybe since the 80s? Yeah, since the 80s, and actually, it's an honor to be with all you fellow Landmark authors. And actually, Siok was telling me that she is also an author who has stayed with Landmark all these years, and so it's not just Gwee who is the last one remaining. And she says she's older than Gwee. So here we go. I thought to kick us off with one of Landmark's actually youngest voices, Jonathan, who's here today. And I think each of the authors will read from their book, but they also tell us a little bit about their book, what it's about, I'll give a bit of introduction, and then we'll proceed to reading. So Jonathan, please kick us off for those who are in person.
Thanks so much, Daryl. Good morning to the however many of you who are tuning in to the Facebook, and to all of you here. Thank you for joining us today. It's a real privilege to be here alongside poets and writers who I've respected for many, many years. I'll also share that Miss Heng was actually my creative writing mentor many, many years ago. It's just a strange kind of serendipity that I'm now sharing this space on this panel with her. As Daryl mentioned, my name is Jonathan. I have a book that came out with Landmark just this year. We had the launch a couple of weeks ago. The book is titled Going Home, and it's a sequence of poetry that really delves into different elements of my family background. As Daryl mentioned, my dad is Malaysian, my mom is South Korean, and I grew up here in Singapore, though I was born in the US. And the book really takes poetry as a way of examining different facets of my family's history. And some of the poems that I'd like to read for you today delve not only into the familial history, but also a little bit about some of the concerns and questions that I've been wrestling with and I've been contending with that have found their way into a kind of poetic structure at the end of all of that. So I'll be reading, how many poems shall I read, Daryl?
Four poems will do.
4 sounds good. I'll read you 4 poems.
Yeah.
So the first poem is called Malaysian American. It's about my grandparents who migrated from Kuala Lumpur to Houston, Texas in the 1980s. Malaysian American, Houston, Texas. This is not a world of dirty honorifics and moneyed connections. This is not a world of rubber signatures and absent partners. This is not the unraveling of nationality in the shadow of Sungai Wang Plaza and the ammo depot that sprouted from dust. This is not the spitfire of Pasar Malams, the breaking of Tosei, the pulsations of Klang Gospel Hall, the roar of Harleys and accordions across oil palm roads. There is no clicking of tongues in Latin. Only the empty gazes of the Queen and her royals adorning the walls of an unused room. There are no London rains or stylish looks, only the vacant smiles of southern dilettantes. The people are gracious, the roads are wide, the city shudders with promise. Here is the big Texan house. Here are the spaghetti highways. Here are the white faces that dot the streets. Here is the Californian sun that was given away. Here are the queues and here are the moors. Here are the tears of an uprooted mother. Thank you. So that poem was very much inspired by my grandparents' experience of moving to Houston from KL, and the mother in the final line is a reference to my grandmother. So my dad was out of university by the time they migrated, so he didn't exactly grow up in Houston, but he had some kind of engagement and experience with the city. Growing up, would continue to go with my family whenever we could to visit my grandparents and extended family in Houston, Texas, as they made a new life for themselves as, Malaysian Chinese immigrants, basically. The next poem that I'd like to read to you is called Yangban. So on my mother's side, they claim heritage to the Yangban class in Korea, which was really an aristocratic class that was composed of the kind of bureaucratic and the military elite. And, I grew up hearing lots of stories about my ancestors on my mother's side who trace some kind of ancestry to people who were in the courts, people who served in the military, and to an ancestor who helped to really devise and invent the Korean alphabet. And I was thinking a lot about what this heritage means in relation to the stories that I'd heard about how my mother grew up. So my mom is South Korean, but she moved from Seoul to Hong Kong, where she grew up. And Yangban was an attempt to think through how these questions of inherited, privilege / nobility interact with the reality of the lives that my family members have lived. So this is Yangban. No more pipes slid between the lips by servile fingers, no gormless heraldry by dusty inroads, no bodies perched on donkeys or heaved aloft by desperate shoulders, soft beneath the folds of fabric, face between fans and horsehair hats, the spoils of smeared ink, no more gaudy suits, sutured in Tokyo, paid in thick bundles and kneeling wives, as pliant as 4 generations of inherited duty. No feet will touch the ground. No more daughters ignored, only the roughness of hands that gripped logs and mouths that swallowed colonial tongues. No more agonizing over tethered absences, 6 mouths by 1,000 squares, only the gate of plenty and upturned noses. The facility of language in uneven weight, the danger of empty disquisition, only the fawning and forgetting, the scholar and the general, the noble, the ignoble, the farmland and the grassy mounds, the residue of history, soft like mollusks. Thank you. I'll mention I was reading an article about the Yangban, and one of the fun facts from that article was that this aristocratic class, they would have people that would carry them around hoisted in these kinds of carriages, I suppose. And they were so immobile and they were so, stagnant in a way. They barely had to walk on the ground. It got so bad, that a lot of them, their muscles began to atrophy. So they became soft. And I was reading that and thinking about how far removed that is from my life right now. And it was just bizarre to me. So that's part of the inheritance that I have. The next poem I'd like to read to you is called Yellow Face. And I wrote this poem a couple of years ago in response to a controversy where there was an e-payments ad that featured a Chinese Singaporean actor who was dressed up in brownface as a way of representing an Indian, Singaporean Indian person. And, there was a lot of debate that was stoked over this because, it was abhorrent and kind of galling that it actually went out into the public. But for me, it brought up the question of who gets to belong in Singapore. What does nationality connote? Foreignness? What does it mean to be a naturalized person? What does it mean to belong? And, the conceit of Yellowface came from the fact that I am, in effect, a migrant to Singapore. But because I claim East Asian heritage and, I look Chinese, I can comfortably pass as part of Singapore's majority, which had me thinking about the ways in which privilege operates, even at the level of the skin in relation to so many folks who've been reviled or who've been denigrated on the basis of their skin color and seen as being not part of a Singaporean community. So I was thinking through all of that and moments when I felt foreign in Singapore, and that all kind of coalesced in this poem, Yellowface. So this is Yellowface. When I was 10, I shared an accent with my best friend. Flattened quasi-American syllables. He by way of Sweden from India. Me, the pressure of lucidity across Houston, Singapore, Seoul. We were estranged, not yet local, not wholly foreign, gravitating in constellations of starched white, navy blue. I once thought it was merely the stubbornness of the tongue, breaking the illusion of a yellow face streaked in green. The questions that followed, Why you slang? Where you learn Chinese? The furrowed brows. I stopped trying, settled with unease, and withdrew to strummed guitars, reggae by hazy midnight and rocky mountaintops. I learned how to sing for Hari Raya. Kwame says a multiracial nation ignores its multiracial children to its peril. In the office, our English glides, articulate, Mandarin sheathed until further notice. Never mind that we look closer to Punjabi, Korean, Kristang. Sikhs are the other, he says, eyes welcoming us into the tightest of social compacts, curiously absent from special silos. By the crunch of bosam, wrapped in lettuce and slathered with gochujang, we feel the edges of the only English we seem to know best. The tang of crushed lemon filters the soju. Were you the only Korean in your class, your level, your unit? How far down will these roots dig? The faces turn, masking our shame from the elders at the table. I have been back for 2 months and have swallowed the tonic of an online divide. It seems simple. We do not make costumes of our friends. I forget I do not inhabit this country's skin, not just yet. It is one thing to be asked where you're from in Britain, and another to be asked the same question within weeks in the place that will always, almost feel like home. Thank you. So that's the poem Yellow Face. And a lot that went into it, a lot of thinking. The Kwame in the poem is Kwame Anthony Appiah, who's a professor of philosophy at New York University. And he is very interested in Singapore, actually. He finds the way that the Singaporean state enforces these categories of race really, really fascinating. And when he teaches about race, as a philosopher and as a professor, he always cites Singapore. So I remember I was reading an article that he wrote around the same time. So that made its way into the poem. So in keeping to the 4-poem allocation, the last poem I'll be reading to you today is called Friday Evening. It's a kind of blessing over my neighborhood in a way. And it was inspired by my friend Leonard Yip, who's a fine nature writer, who wrote a really interesting essay about Singapore as an edgeland. The edgelands, that's a concept that was devised by British theorists to think about the kind of interstitial place between urban areas and natural areas. And Leonard was really thinking intently and heavily about how Singapore, because of these constant interactions between the natural environment and the built-up environment, every day in Singapore, essentially makes it a kind of edgeland, if not an edgeland unto itself as an island. And I was thinking a lot about these interactions between urban and natural as this poem came together, as I was thinking about my neighborhood. So this is a poem called Friday Evening. Friday Evening, Singapore. Blessed be the light upon the tiny, dark plains. Leonard Yip, Edgeland visible. Bless the light that drapes upon the trees, glistening as a golden gossamer. Bless the roots that cause the earth to crumple, spilling down the walls of concrete drains. Bless the scampering of the monitor lizard, darting into grassy cover. Bless the arias that map the treetops, sparkling into scattered flocks. Bless the edges of blue and pink, the blending into ocular paint. Bless the dance of wilder grasses, the serrated line along the footpaths. Bless the leaves that kiss the forehead, curling over calloused concrete. Bless the cathedral formed of branch and frond, covering a tarmac aisle. Bless the balmy breath of emerald, rustling through a tattered mind. And bless the calm of afterglow, coalescing in a wisp of prayer. Thank Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the reading, Jonathan. Lovely poems. We'll move on to Tian, who will read from her latest collection as well.
Right. Thank you. As Jonathan has pointed out, it is must be God's divine planning and timing, right? To be on the same stage right now. How many years later? Almost a decade. Close to it, maybe. Yeah. 9 years, he claims. Okay. I'm going to read 3 poems. The first will be, I don't know whether it's auspicious. I think it's the start of the 7th lunar month. The first poem is actually called Open Coffin, Rainbow Blouse. I wanted to start this collection, which is my 6th collection, with this poem because it is suggestive of like seeing the real thing, seeing mortality in its face. Many of my collections, some critics claim are very maybe myopic and small, and just focus on my family. But perhaps that's what hits me most. So this is the first poem called Open Coffin, Rainbow Blouse. A few Teochew phrases you left behind as oral memory, like beautiful bajus you stored away in the wardrobe. Teak wood that survived 3 house movings, like you enduring. Kebayas you outgrew due to age, burdens, extra weight. Your good taste in colors, you kept them in pristine shape. Washed, ironed, crease-free. Hung in an order understood only by you. Did you think for me to burn them with you, to bring to your other home? I imagine cremation fire brightening your way, only to be told by the undertakers that a few pieces are now allowed in incineration, only to be greeted by a sign at Kwangming San Temple that echo burning is recommended and no more joss sticks. Clothes did not show your deep sheets. Now, each rainbow reminds me of the rainbow stripe you burn in. So that's in memory of my mother. In fact, the whole collection, the first half is really in memory of my mother. The second poem, it's Teochew Proverbs. Well, I just asked Daryl if this is being recorded because I was wondering whether I should subject myself to a bit of embarrassment by maybe articulating a few phrases in Teochew, Yeah, I'll try that, I think. Just for trying, right? One should get effort, isn't it? So this second poem is called Your Teochew Proverbs. I will read it in English first, to be fair, right? Then maybe I will read some of the expressions in Teochew, I hope, and not embarrass my mother up there. Your Teochew Proverbs. Now that you passed, your proverbs ring pure and clear. Paper cannot wrap fire. What is yours is yours. To be old is difficult, counting on children even more so. A tiger's legacy, its skin. A man's, his name. A flower does not bloom forever. The sky is not forever fine. The rich can be poor. The poor can be rich. Fire and water have no kin. People act, heavens watch. And now, I miss your voice, forgetting my Teochew words. How mute I have become when earlier, how deft. I will attempt now to read a few of them, maybe in Teochew, I think, just for the variety and I think to hear the various sounds that we need to hear. I'll go English and I'll go Teochew. Hey. Paper cannot wrap fire. What is yours is yours. Lekai to see lekai. I'll end with the last, which is people act, heavens watch. Nang lo zo, ti lo toi. So I find that there's usually a kind of like rhythm, in the saying, which of course I cannot quite capture or recapture perhaps in English. Yeah. And the last, since it's so close to National Day, this is an occupational hazard. I'm a teacher. I must, of course, celebrate a little bit. But on a more serious note, I wrote this poem, My City, My Sayang, after I spent 1 year away from Singapore after my mother's death. My mother's death really shook me because I was very gullible and naive. Even though she was already growing old and I was already, in my 50s, it never occurred to me that nothing is permanent. I know in abstraction, but when it happened in real life and she passed on, it was quite a shock to my system, I think. So I actually resigned from my long career of teaching. Had to recalibrate my life, spend a year with my sister who is Australian, and then realized after a year that it's like running away. So I had to come back. And when I came back, I wrote My City, My Sayang, which is a retake on an earlier poem called My City, My Canvas. Yeah. Some MOE officials should be listening to this. Okay, My City, My Sayang. How is my city a song? How do I float tunes in her river? Do I go whistling in her gardens, swinging between her chic skyscrapers? I want to feel the jingle in her steps. I want to touch the twinkle in her clap. I want to slurp her moon as icy pop, to wear her sun drop as a ring. I want to be attuned to her river, hear sanctuaries in her wayang, glide with her grace to embrace my city, my sayang. To those who raise me on do-re-mi, 1, 2, 3, to those whose song I hear and sing, to those whose tunes are not yet heard, I want to court them, pitch them, harmonize their melodies. How is my city a song? Hear her from within. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Siok. That was a beautiful reading, and thank you for sharing some of the phrases in Teochew as well. So it's not a purely monolingual reading. There's a comment from Gwee here who has joined us on Facebook. So he's watching the Facebook live stream, although he's not here in person. He says, he says, "Wow, this Jonathan's so handsome in person." It's his actual comment. It's ridiculous, yes. By the way, Gwee, if you are watching, since you are, Siok would like you to know that she's also a landmark author who stayed for so many years. Okay, we'll round off with reading from my book. It's called Anything But Human, so it's here. And I'm getting quite tired of trying to explain what the book's about because it's like I always get it wrong each time. So what I'll do is I'll read the blurb because I got someone to blurb it. And this is Larry Yapil, a good friend of mine who's a Filipino poet. And I'll just read his description of my book. So maybe that's a new take. So he says that in Anything But Human, we encounter a world that is simultaneously sundered and barely begun, where debts are paid, but only in hindsight and on discount, and where the self is to be found, yes, but always fragmented and in places we hardly expect it to be found. In the eye of a suckling pig, in organic jam, in flies. These are poems of aftermath and prototype. They are parables of how to survive a cataclysm we imagine has yet to come, but has actually already arrived. And in the spirit of all the prophets of old, Daryl Lim, with a wink and smirk, heralds, both the end is yet to come, both the end is to come, and we have missed our chance. So that was Larry. And so this book, I think, just to add a little bit more, is kind of trying to grapple with the question of how to write poetry at the end of the world. And not the end of the world in real terms, but in kind of poetic terms. I really wrote this book, in a way I wrote myself into a rut, into a sense of an end and a catastrophe. And then I sort of found ways outside of it and wrote myself out of that hole. So the poem is the book is divided into kind of like two parts. And so without further ado, I'll just read some poems, just give you a sense. And the first poem I'll read is called Fly Forgotten as a Dream. It's a series of prose poems. And actually the title, if you are familiar with your hymns, comes from a hymn by, I think, Wesley, but I can't quite remember. And the line goes, "They fly forgotten as a dream, dies at the opening day." And the hymn always struck me when I heard it being sung and when I sang it in chapel in school, because I went to a mission school. The rest of the poem is quite upbeat and optimistic. This section of the hymn is very bleak. So those lines always stuck with me, and I always kind of remembered them. And so they came up again when I was writing this series of poems. So I'll read two poems from the Fly Forgotten series. Fly Forgotten as a Dream, 1. Entirely within expectations, the pigeons aggregate to an unkindness. What was dead air insinuates itself into a cyclone. Scrunched up tissues fall like snow on grass. There are stretches of walkway still in receipt of sunlight. We walk in circles until we reach the earth's squalid core. You ask me, what is the significance of mangled drink cans floating in the sewer? What is the import of the frangipani blooming without an audience? The water is ruddy with public opinion. On the feedback form, I shade in cells of my own invention. The second poem is Fly Forgotten as a Dream, Part 2. We wake up with 5th-generation antibiotics in our mouths. My skin is scaly with the pieties of the past. Everything we do now is terribly ill-advised. Just yesterday, you brought home a pack of sickly biscuits. They taste deeply of the amnesia we've grown to love and cherish. I chance upon an old photograph of people eating around a banquet table. There is a suckling pig with cherries in its eyes. I find another photo of almost the same scene, but the pig has my eyes. The rain beats on my window with great urgency. At night, the bed is hot with the suspicion of meaning. The next poem is called Singapore Pastoral, and that kind of breaks away from the Fly Forgotten poems, which I read before. Singapore Pastoral is quite a strange poem because you can't really think of a Singapore Pastoral, or at least conventionally people wouldn't think of a Singapore Pastoral. So I wanted to write about what that would look like. And what I landed on was Lim Chu Kang. So Lim Chu Kang was kind of, where all the farmlands, army training areas are. And probably it's the closest thing we have to a pastoral. But of course, I sort of reinterpret and fracture this pastoral in my own perverse way, I guess. The crows are fresh with the scent of our gloriously burnt dead. Around the corner, the boys rehearse the conquests of our regional partners. The rumor is it's earmarked for a spaceport or sex tourism, despite the legions of mosquitoes. World wars are ways to avoid cremation. Granduncle used to tell us how it always smelled of pig shit. The last tiger roams with incredibly low triglycerides. An old man drowns, feeding the reeds, which we will use to make our rice blue. Okay, so that was Singapore Pastoral. The last poem I'll read is called Some or the Other Number, and it's from the second half of the book, where things are in some ways being re-updated, reloaded, rebooted. You can think of it as a program. And it was in some ways quite inspired by The Matrix, which I guess is kind of dated now. But it's the idea of the world resetting. And so now this reset program is roaming the world. It's called Some or the Other Number. Being human is an ongoing activity. Most of the time is spent downloading the latest updates. Today I found some new numbers on the back of an envelope. The universe makes a noise like cabbage being chopped. He has told me one day we will teem the earth in our resplendent grey. Look at how the storm water schemes against our best intentions. You know, at no point ever has there been so much history. Fancy that. Thank you. Well, we have still a bit of time. Actually, how's the changeover happening? Okay. Sorry, welcome back. We had a bit of a technical interruption. We have about 10 minutes or so, and I thought maybe since we are all here, we shouldn't just do reading, we should have a bit of discussion. And maybe I'll just pose a question. This is not prep in advance, so just off the top of my head. And it strikes me that for both Jonathan and for Siok Tian, family plays a huge role in both of your collections, these two collections. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that, because I think for Siok, you mentioned not just your mother, but also your sister. And in some ways, that journey to go and see her was part of trying to reconnect or reorient yourself. And in Jonathan's book, I think family plays a huge role. It's like a sprawling... And in fact, your book starts off with a history of your family's migrations. And you felt that was important. So maybe we can start with that. Why did you feel that need to talk about family history?
Thank you for the question. There's an extent to which the question of belonging has bedeviled me for a long time. And for a while, I was writing individual poems that examined and dealt with moments of friction that my family experienced as they settled into different places and different locales. Whether that was my Malaysian Chinese grandparents settling into Houston, my Korean family settling into Hong Kong. But I came to a kind of place where I was writing these individual poems kind of in a very itinerant way. And I felt that there was, similar to how you always feel the need to explain parts of your book to your readers and to appreciative audiences. I felt a similar way in terms of how to bring all these poems together. And so the beginning of the book has a chronology of my family's history. And, I call it a brief history of movement. It's different dates and, that feature different key moments when, from my early ancestors who left China to move to Malaya all the way to more contemporary migrations in the 20th century. Because I felt that it was important in helping to contextualize why so many of the poems are the way that they are, and also because in a way they kind of mirror the structure, the movement of the poems within the collection. So the early parts of the collection really are engaging with imagined and real moments of assimilative friction that my family experienced. And I think a lot of that grew out of these feelings of unease, sometimes, very adolescent feelings, but even feelings that I have nowadays of not knowing where I belong. I was like, do I belong in Malaysia? Do I belong in South Korea? Do I belong in the US? Am I, in Singapore? And I, became a Singaporean when I was 18. I was a permanent resident growing up. And I think one of the conduits by which I was engaging with this question was through the poetry, because, you know, as a kind of literary genre, I appreciated the space that it provided for me to deal in ambiguity and complexity and contradiction. I think contradiction was the really important thing that I was working through in the poems and thinking about these questions of nationality and citizenship. So yeah, that's a little bit behind why so much of the collection is about family and about where the many places that I came from and where the many places that my family still is. Yeah, still are, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks for I think that's a great way to start us off. So it's really about belonging and finding your place. Is why it's a question that you're trying to answer in some ways. Siok, do you have a response?
I think it's very difficult, it's very complex, but I just want to give a simple answer because whether or not we like it, we spend so much time, frankly, you know, we cannot deny that emotional ties. And because the tensions that I feel very much is at home is something that I have to deal with. Because in some ways it's like a microcosm, I sometimes feel, of Singapore, the larger society, because my parents really could not agree on the type of school I should go to, be it an English stream or a Chinese stream. And that was in the 60s, you know, so those were the concerns of that time. And I think I became a product of that, you see, struggling with this notion of, should I adopt, you know, English or Mandarin kind of thing. So that is important because that's just another way of questioning this sense of belonging, because your language shapes your world, you know, right? So because I am schooled in English literature for a pragmatic reason, you know, for the 1960s Singapore, then of course I am shaped in a certain way. But at home, I'm actually listening only to dialect because my parents were illiterate, you see. So this is the real question, because your language will shape you, just like what Jonathan is dealing with, right? You know your Korean, you know your English, you know, and then you're so subject to this new media language. All that will factor into your sense of identity, I think. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm still grappling with that still, actually.
Yeah. And actually, it's interesting you bring up language, because that is another commonality that I think threads through your collection, Jonathan's, and in some ways mine.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. So I think you spoke a bit about that sense of dialect and that split between, I guess, the private language of the home and the public language of your life. And actually, you become
or the pragmatic language of livelihood, you know.
Yeah. But also it's more than that also, because for you now you have like you're a poet in English, mostly purely in English. So you've like made the identity lah. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that decision. I think for Jonathan as well, how you live with the sort of or not live with. This sounds very weird. How you sort of approach using English maybe as a medium of poetic expression, because it's not. We all had choices, I guess. Well, sort of. We could have made some choices, whether to be English poets or not. Did it cause any, did it raise any question marks? Did you feel a bit strange when you were first doing it? Yeah. Don't know. No?
Okay, maybe this applies to me a bit more, because my first published piece was actually a Mandarin essay.
Oh, see, yeah.
Okay, in secondary 3. And that's because my Chinese teacher said, submit this. Okay, fine, obediently I submitted. But it never crossed my mind that I'll be that strong. And I think I'm realistic enough to know that I cannot really write in Mandarin.
Right.
Although that would have been, I think, my father's preferred language, because he really fought with my mother about sending the children either to a Chinese stream or, and my mother insisted on English stream. Having said that though, writing in English doesn't pose problem, but you know, I really want to capture some of the ideas in that Teochew dialect, and that is why I attempted that piece about your Teochew province and decided to use Teochew to say some of the saying. For a pragmatic reason, I wrote in English, basically, right? Because that's the easiest medium, and it's a way for me to resolve certain tensions. So that's part of the reason. The other not so glamorous reason, which is has to be said, I think. You see, when I was in NUS, and that's when I started writing, there was a literary journal that time called Singer, and Arthur Yap was the editor then, the late Arthur Yap. And in some ways, he's also one of the kindest men I've met, because when I kind of like submitted it to him for consideration, the first piece that he chose, I got paid for it. It was like, wow. Yeah, wow, I got paid, It's a very pragmatic thing. Then I realized that, hey, I can earn some pocket money that way. It never occurred to me, you see. And I think that was really part of the pragmatic and not so glamorous start to my accidental life as a poet, frankly.
Well, that's wonderful. It's kind of the realities of how the scene was at that time, right? Yeah. Jonathan, do you have anything to say on the topic of language?
Yeah, it's... I think maybe particularly in the situation of Singapore, English has this weird and fraught position, both the language of pragmatism, but also the language of colonialism. And I think especially more so from, well, I was going to say from Miss Heng's generation and earlier, people who have lived with the memory of living under British rule. I think for me, fundamentally, it comes down to, or it came down to the question of which language I felt I expressed a lot of these thoughts and feelings most naturally. In my home, even though my family has all of these scattered pieces in its composition, we spoke English at home. My dad was educated, he's from Malaysia, but educated in Australia and the UK. My mom grew up in Hong Kong, and at a time when it was still under British rule, and she learned English as a second language, or even third maybe, from attending British schools. She was speaking Korean at home and Cantonese in everyday life. And so, and they were living in the US when they had me, and we moved here. So, growing up, English was the primary language, if the main language we spoke at home. And I think, there's this question or adage of the heart language. What is the language you think in, and the language that you feel in, the language that comes most intuitively and naturally to you, and in many ways the language to which you belong. And for me, in the end it all came back to English, even though I grew up listening to Cantonese, I grew up listening to Korean. Growing up in the Singaporean education system, I had to learn Mandarin, even though my immediate family doesn't speak Mandarin. But in terms of the vehicle for the poetry to be presented, it was still English. And I think for me it was complicated when I had the opportunity to study in the UK. And, I think, and this is maybe a tendency I've noticed with Singaporeans, Malaysians, Hong Kongers, when they go to the UK, they're confronted with the sense that even though English was natural to them for many, many years, they come face to face with a different kind of English that alienates them, that is unfamiliar, that denaturalizes it in a way. And so much of that is, inextricable from the question of colonialism. And so I think being there kind of gave me a different way of thinking about the language and engaging with the language, because, I studied English literature, and one of the things that I had to do for my degree was to learn to translate Middle English from the 13 and 1400s into contemporary English. And I was, I would be working on these translations of the Gawain poet and Chaucer, and I'd be thinking to myself, what were my ancestors doing in the 14th and 15th century? They were literally, a world away from this linguistic, epistemic sphere that probably wasn't even, hadn't even gone past Britain at that time. So, not even talking about, the rest of Europe or the US. And so that kind of jolted me a little bit when I was thinking about the writing of poems and the writing of poetry again. So I think it's a complicated question because it's tied up with these colonial histories. It's tied up with all the ways in which English has traveled and why it's traveled and why so many people speak it. And then, then we think about Singapore and the pragmatic question of why English was adopted as a primary medium of communication. And I think, or I like to think that a lot of the poems in the collection are a reflection of these ways of wrestling with different Englishes and the different tensions that surround English as a language of communication, expression, and a language of poetry.
Yep. Thanks very much. I think we should probably draw the panel to a close because we need to hand over to the next set of authors from Pagesetters. But I thought on this point of language, I think the other way to think about it, maybe a way to close us off, is that poetry and the poetry that we rewrite is in a way to find or invent a language that I think helps us make sense of the world. And I find that across all three of our collections, and maybe that's a thought to leave with viewers here and online. Thank you very much, everyone.
Welcome to Poetry Festival Singapore, Day 2. We just finished with the first session with Landmark Book Poet, hosted so well by Daryl Lim. Thank you, Daryl. And today we start with the next session, which is with Ethos Books Poets, Pagesetters. And I would like to extend a warm welcome to our two panelists, Heng and Esther. Welcome. Good morning. Something a little about Ethos. Ethos Books is an independent publisher of literary fiction, non-fiction, and poetry. And it gives voice to emerging and exciting writers from diverse backgrounds and help foster an environment in which literature and the arts not only survive, but thrive. And in short, they nurture the growing literary community in Singapore and throughout the region. So thank you, Ethos, for having our poets here. Thank you. I would first start with a little bit of an introduction with our two poets, with Anne. Anne Heng is best known as the author of Bang My Car 2012. It was released in 2012, yeah.
Yes, that's right.
And a Singlish-English collection of short stories. And she has just published her first collection of poetry, Burning Walls for Paper Spirits 2021. And is also a co-editor of the literary anthologies Poetry Moves 2020 and Food Republic, which was also released in 2020. So welcome, Anne.
Thank you.
And sorry about that. We have next is Esther. Hi, Esther.
Hi.
Esther is the author of Red Earth, Blue Cactus Press, and is editor-in-chief and founder of the Tiger Moth Review, an independent eco-journal of art and literature. She is co-editor of Making Kin, eco-feminist essays from Singapore, which is also published by Ethos, and two poetry anthologies, Poetry Moves, Ethos again, and Little Things. Her essays are forthcoming or have been published in the Trumpeter, Eco Theo Review, Sinking City Review, and Quarterly Literary Review Singapore. A literature educator by profession, she is passionate about the entanglements in art, science, literature, spirituality, and ecology. Thank you so much, Esther.
Thanks.
I'm so delighted to have both of you here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. So I would, we can start with your poems, Anne, and yeah.
So I'll start by reading 3 poems from my first collection, Burning Walls for Paper Spirits. And I'll say a little bit about the collection before I dive into the poems. So I think it's a collection that I really only understood after it was published rather than as I was writing it, because it crystallized in the days after. And it was my attempt to explore how we become thing-like in an urban environment. So, so much of our lives in the city makes us numb to the things around us. But the more I wrote about it, the more I considered we are like objects. The rest of non-human life came surging through. So not just nature as we understood it, but also electricity or, different dimensions of spirituality were also things that have come through these collections. So the 3 poems that I read today give a sort of sense of how I was approaching these other dimensions and the way it sort of permeates throughout concrete lived lives every day. And the first poem that I'm going to read is called Turning. And it's turning as in turning the year and time passing, but also turning as in the symbolism of the serpent. So there is the idea of the Ouroboros, the serpent consuming its own tail. And that's meant to be a sort of cyclical symbol of life turning. And it is a poem that is cyclical as well. So if you end with the last line, you could read the first line again and again, it wouldn't stop. But I would not burden you with that. I'll just read it once. Turning. Turning a year older, turning the year I am descaling, keeling my tongue, shucking cheek blades, unthroating glutinous words. Sloughing off sand and sheaf, I am myself despite myself. The braille shield over my eyes ossifies, the air grows dim. I get used to the world as a ripped sock over my head. No need for friends who shout, snake, snake. I am too tired to tuck the hour or tail the spleen. My ecdysis is a slow-fanged vestigial eruption into limblessness. Over there, myself shed, and I am naked, I suppose, whispering the same pitiful forked tongue. Voices and choices, here, there, Singlish, English, lions, logic, pulau, pura, trees, forests, apples, gods, sleeps, deaths. A breath, intercalated between each pair, an uncertain anatomy of Eden, a pause until turning a year older, and so on. It could go on forever, but I think I'll leave it there. The second poem that I'm going to read is titled Keppel Port, and as many of us know, Keppel is a part of Singapore in the south where the landscape is dominated by these giant container cranes. And I think at this point, one of the things I should also say is that I give thanks for my illustrator, Chelsea Sia. She's someone who has, I feel visually she has drawn the sort of artistic rendition of these poems. So really, when you buy this book, you get two collections in one. You get the art, and you get the words. Just saying. But going back to Keppel Port, it's my attempt to explore not just the urban landscape of Singapore, but to push back against these ideas that what is material and made by humans is necessarily ugly and sterile. There is a sort of hidden, rusting material life that goes on vitally in these parts of the island. So I'll read it. Keppel Port. After Sundays, the church dome rises in white silence. Hours pass southwards, washing the sky with bells. A priest sits in his windowless office, listening to confessions. From container cranes at Keppel Port, steel pulleys in sun-rays streaks, heaving barnacled lucre. The weight of sea travel lifted and dropped by scalloped behemoths. Cheek by jaw, ocean cargoes screech and groan. Under horns of rust, these wounded dragons have fallen from the clouds and the largest of space. He wonders at what he hears, where he sits, and who he is to be opening this small door in his heart. And I think it's a rusty door that he's opening. The last poem that I'm going to read from this collection is it's one of my favorites, really, because one of the things I try to do in this collection is explore material walls, but also walls as in boundaries between different bodies, different kinds of corporealities. And I have a series of poems where I take different buildings and walls in everyday life in Singapore and try to think of them as organisms. So there's a sort of poem from the viewpoint of an HDB, and there's also this poem, Monday in the Jungle. The body is a house, I close the door in MRT crowds. With the safety latch on, the mouth is good for yawning without offense. For it is a public service to keep your home clean, to not pass germs so the teeth may sprout unbidden leaf buds and private smiles growing mold. I display a mattress on the roof, leave an overnight car park coupon on the basement window shield. It is time to unstopper the third eye. Now I stand forth to appease the town council by growing a jungle only inside my house. This is called being considerate. I'm hardworking at doing nothing, letting the arms lie unspooled as humid rivers, the knees unlocked as lakes in Lalang, the feet gone to earth. No noise after 10 p.m. The breath running as a cloud before the thunderstorm, the face raining in monsoon flowers. If the neighbors knock, they will hear nothing. There is no Monday in the jungle. The eyes sleep seeing. HDB blocks monumental in the sunlight, where ageless cicadas call. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for those lovely poems. They are so lyrical when you were reading them. It's a very different, quality when you actually hear the poem being read by the poet. So thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Esther, would you like to read? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Shilpa, and for that lovely poem. I was smiling and laughing at the part about the town council. Yeah. Okay, so I'll just say a little bit about Red Earth. Red Earth is published by Blue Cactus Press. It's part of this Ethos and Pagesetters distribution channel because I think they work together to distribute the book in Asia because Blue Cactus is based in Washington. So the book is my first poetry collection and is organized into 3 parts. The first being Dream Fruit, which draws, actually many of my poems draw from my dreams. The second is About Love, and the third would be Pilgrims. So today I'm reading from the final section, Pilgrims, and it is quite a rare occasion, I think, because I don't usually read from this section. The 3 poems that I'll read, maybe before I do that, I'll read the epigraphs just to give you an understanding of what this book hopes to do. So I have 3 epigraphs. The first is, indigenous is a birthright word. No amount of time or caring changes history or substitutes for so deep fusion with the land. And this is by Robin Wall Kimmerer. The second is by Grace Nichols. Many have stamped themselves with the ink of exile. But you, my daughter, from a land of many waters, belong to the world. And finally, by Hafiz, nevertheless become an oasis for all things. So I think these 3 epigraphs, hopefully, they encapsulate the spirit of the collection. So the first poem that I'm reading is entitled Lemon Beach, and this is after Linda Gregg's Greece When Nobody's Looking. And it's written after this place in Mauritius, in the south of Mauritius, Lemon Beach. The night is a new kind of blackness that surprises. Infinite stars like crushed ice overhead. This is land birthed by fire and water, millions of years ago. She asked, "Do you want to go and watch the Sega?" "Yes," he said, and they brought along the bottle. Music on the beach, a crew directing Sega dancers by bonfire and spotlight. The sea crashing into the dazzling sky. A poetry of blue lagoons, bleached coral, and bonfires smoldering. So this is the first poem. And the second is entitled Monsoon, written after the clan jetties in Penang. Monsoon. The southerly winds have arrived, and with them, occasional showers and thunderstorms washing the afternoons down with a shingle of rain. They will stay for 4 months, returning again next June. Our plants rely on this gift of seasonal rain to survive. We try to care for them, inventing a way to collect the rain with a wooden pole and a small bucket, 14 floors above the ground. In another place, you could walk above the water, barefoot on wooden boards warmed by the sun. Buckets on land, each distinctive clan making an incense offering to the goddess Matu. Prayers coiling out to sea. Birds on the wire signaling rain. Fishermen's boats lie like forgotten relics, berthed along the pier. Empty fish traps, stacked like totems, watchful. Plastic bottles floating in the canals, aimless and drifting. A lone path funnels into the open straits, where rotting wooden stumps remember old roots. Before the storm, a grey seabird landed and folded her wings, waiting, still. Next came the onslaught of wind and rain. Remember how we took off our shoes, 2 unlikely pilgrims, seeking shelter in the red-roofed temple, as the rain licked away at the wood beneath our feet. A red altar, a wrinkled orange. The temple keeper in his shorts, his slippers, his well-poised umbrella, lighting incense in a humble offering. How he kept our shoes dry under a no-shoes sign. His kindness towards strangers, the lashing rain on zinc. And the last poem I sprung this on Shilpa just right before the panel. I was supposed to read another poem, but I felt that I should go with this. So this is Jakarta Triptych. So if you are familiar with the triptych, which is a religious kind of motif, it is art that is split, well, I suppose organized into 3 panels, and each tell a story, but there's a coherence within the entire triptych. And so I tried to write a poem that was presented in the same way. So the first is Candi Sewu, ruins of a temple ground designed to contain the cosmos, a silence that echoes in the sizzling heat. I walk to feel the ground underfoot, uncertain of what I am seeking amidst the spiraling sand. Dust all around, broken universe. I step inside the main temple and lose myself in its chambers, another traveler in search of meaning. Around, workers straddle the necks of scattered temples, chisel at stone, restoring looted heads. Prambanan. From a distance, the many faces of the Trimurti tower above us, rising from myth into plain sight. We scurry like ants between stone and shrine, incidental devotees of the intermittent shade. The sun makes his daily rounds, asking to enter at noon. Every day, temple doors oblige. We leave learning of gods that create, preserve, and destroy. Like them, we too make and break something each day. Candi Borobudur. Elephants on parade. Pilgrims with umbrellas float like lotuses along the divine path, seeking peace. I miss the sunrise over Borobudur, but each elevation promises renewed light. Buddhas in stupas, many headless. I read in the ornate bas-reliefs, poses and eroded colors, the tales of princes, thieves, and mere commoners. The undying rain reminds me of my mortality, each drop a chip in time. I arrive at the top, still searching, and it's the end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of the set of poems. I'm really amazed because one is located so close to us and one takes us to Mauritius and Borobudur, you know, and so coming back to your poems, and I sense that there is this, you know, interplay of mechanics with the human life. But when you look at them closely, you can actually see a lot of layered interpretation. So how do you go about, like, when you were putting this collection together, right? The title of the collection itself is very intriguing. So did the poems just come naturally to you, or like you worked towards this collection, and like, how did you just put it? And the title, of course, yeah.
So I think I'll answer the first question, which is the process of putting this collection together. And I mean, I must thank my editor, Nkage, for being very patient with this collection. And it started as a more rambling, expensive, and really not as coherent a collection as it currently is. And it was arranged by theme, which would have made it a much weaker sort of first collection to start with. But I think as we went through the poems, and I did all sorts of exercises where I print out all the possible combinations of the poems. I put them down on my room floor and I arranged it like as if I was playing cards, threw away some, threw away a lot of them. Then I saw what my poems were trying to say to me about the connections, as you rightly point out, Shilpa, between the human, the non-human, the modern human, which is, as I've recently learned from eco-criticism, is something that has been thought about quite a bit, but I was working my way through it through my own aesthetics here. And it's something that relates to the title of this collection as well, which came very, very late in the game. In fact, only where I had the complete suite of poems that I understood, oh, this is a collection about that troubles boundaries. You know, the idea of walls is skin, the ideas of walls between people and place. These walls need to be burned down, but it's also about the spirits that live, or the sort of energies that live in things, in people. And I think it's a very special sort of human arrogance to think that everything material is made by humans. In fact, all materiality came before humans, right? In that sense, before humankind. And so I think that's what the collection of the title is trying to articulate. There is a poem that relates to the 7th month in it as well. I think that's really been mentioned today. So that's another allusion.
That's, yeah. When we talk of how, poetry transcends communities and boundaries, right? This title really emphasizes that and brings a lot of attention to how, as people, as humans, you said, life existed much before humans, right? So I was just, very amazed with this last line of your poem of Keppelport, where you say he wonders at what he hears, where he sits, and who he is, opening the small door to his heart. And you want to say something more about that? Because I really found that very, as I said, it had a lot of layered interpretation to it, but I would like to know what your interpretation of that was.
Right. I think the sort of main protagonist of the poem is a priest listening to confessions, but it's not Sunday, it's a weekday. There's nobody in the church on a weekday. And instead, he's hearing the sort of squeaks and groans of the machinery as they're moving in the distance. And this particular church, I think Chelsea actually took the silhouette exactly from St. Teresa's, which is the church that sits on the hill just before Keppelport. It sits on a sort of height. And this is a bit of historical trivia, but many of the religious places in Singapore in the Catholic Church are built on hills because those were the cheapest plots of land that were available at that time. So schools are on top of hills and so on. But going back to your question, what I see as what he's listening to, he's listening to a sort of confession from the screech of machinery, there's a sort of essential sadness in how the port has sort of taken over the coast. He doesn't quite understand what it's saying. It's not really a voice that's human, but it's something that he intuits quite deeply within his heart. It's a sort of confession from beyond what is human. And a small door opens, and I sort of imagine him looking towards the cranes, looking beyond into the sea, and that sense of openness as well. And what's coming through this door is only just suggested by the end of the poem. It's not clear as a sort of threshold he needs to cross.
Right. That's what I also understood. There's that element of spirituality which is just touched upon, and then it is left at that right, point where it gives you that aha moment, and you are really like looking at how the fatigue of being a human, right? There are times,
so well.
Sometimes really pulls at us, and we want to look beyond that. And we want to explore or at least comprehend what is there beyond that, right? So thank you for those. Thank you. Esther, for your, the first poem, the one on the beach, the Le Monde, right? It is in response to Lisa Gregg's poem.
Linda Gregg's When Nobody's Looking.
Yeah. So what made you choose Linda Gregg? I mean, are you really a fan of her writing, etc.? She does write very good, and she's her craft is very well known, and she has a very lyrical quality to her poems. So
thanks for that question. And I apologize if I'm like shivering because I'm really quite cold. Okay, so I read Linda Gregg because my master supervisor, Boy Kim Cheng, he recommended this book of poems to me, and then I purchased her Sacraments of Desire, and I really liked that poem. I read through the entire collection, but somehow I kept returning to this poem, Greece When Nobody's Looking. I found that doing research about her life, how she actually left behind, let's say like a more modern kind of life, to just really simplify and just live with the bare minimum for years. Also contributed to her craft to be able to just really distill what's important. And I think the subject matter of looking at a place when no one is looking, off season without the tourists, and just being in place really spoke to me. And so Le Monde Beach is the place that I went to for my honeymoon. And I was thinking, how can I I think the place was very important and special also because there were very little kind of man-made lights, and so you could really just be lost in the night, just with the sky, with the stars, and I think the sea and just the ocean, and just being very close, just being very close, to nature, and in Mauritius, I think bonfires are kind of banned, but people still did make bonfires, and so I was also trying to engage with all these ideas as well as bleaching coral that would get washed up ashore. So I think that's why I thought, why not write in the same form in terms of following the number of lines as well as a poetry of, so this is how she also ends the poem. And I wanted to just encapsulate, I think, the moment. And many of the poems in Pilgrims actually refer to, as you rightly pointed out, to places outside of my immediate space, outside of Singapore. But I think the collection also tries to redefine the idea of home and belonging as well, similar to what Jonathan mentioned in the earlier session. Where do we belong? Can we belong to this expanded notion of home, of the world as home? And this also is part of my research interest in eco-poetry, eco-literature, eco-feminism. Like how can we belong in place wherever we go?
Thank you. So building on that eco-journalism, eco-poetry and eco-literature, I mean, you have also edited, you are the editor of Tiger Moth Review, right? And both of you all have just announced another anthology, an open call for another anthology.
Thanks for the plug.
Could you tell us about that? Right.
I'll start and then maybe Anne can add on to that. So I think, thank you so much, Shilpa, for the plug. I mean, for Tiger Moth Review, Anne and Shilpa's poems are also also have been published there. So I think for this new project, it builds on Making Kin. So Making Kin is what was published by Ethos recently, eco-feminist essays from Singapore. And I was thinking about, how we can include Southeast Asia. So not just Singapore, but I mean, Singapore is part of something larger, right? And so I was brainstorming. I met Rina, the first editor, at a panel organized by the Singapore Book Council at one of the Writers' Festivals panels, and we could get along quite well. We had similar ideas, and so I thought to bring her on board. And then I was thinking, maybe it'd be good to involve Anne as well, just to think about our connections. So then the three of us sat down together. We were brainstorming, thinking about everything. And so, we put it together with similar, I think, hopes and aspirations to really try and connect the region. Not just in terms of geography, but also in terms of cultures, in terms of like spaces, imagine kind of notions of space, histories, identities, environments. So I think that is, so the open call went out quite, I think yesterday was it? Yesterday. And it's traveling. It's traveling everywhere.
The wind.
It
the
is.
Phrase
It
that
is.
you use.
Like the felucca. So I mean that is something that we are working on. And we're very excited about it, to be working together. I think this is, aside from Poetry Moves, I've worked with Anne on one poetry publication, but I think this is something that we're going to be working very closely on. So I'm very excited. Anne, go ahead and
I'm very excited as well. I mean, 150% agree with everything that you said. And I think what's also exciting is that it's a cross-genre anthology. So we're looking at fiction and also creative non-fiction, exploring the essay form. And prose is a way of articulating what it means to be eco-critical in a Southeast Asian context. I think what we hope to see in this anthology is attention to perspectives and geographies in Southeast Asia that don't get articulated from a distance, because when we go very far away, you just see Southeast Asia as this region that's been plagued by development, by various climatic disasters and things like that. We don't want to, we want to have more than a sliver of hope in the way we're looking at the environment. We want to explore what it means to live in the highlands of the Philippines, in the highlands of Malaysia and Borneo. We're interested in distinctive geographies, the archipelago, the tidal lines, and we're particularly interested in perspectives that don't get translated elsewhere, that aren't picked up, say, by sort of like larger commercial presses, and that's what we hope to achieve with the anthology.
That sounds really all-encompassing with Southeast Asia. I mean, if you're looking at history and the geographic and the past and maybe even the future, like how a person can interpret what Southeast Asia can look like in the future, going forward with all the countries and archipelagos. Yeah. So another question, and I'm just after a lot of questions here. With being the editor of Food Republic and Poetry Moves, yeah, you have seen a lot of poetry already as editor of an anthology in these two anthologies. So the theme for our poetry festival, and as we are emerging out of this pandemic, is resurgence. And do you foresee a change or a shift in the kind of poems people will be writing as an editor? Of course, as poets, we probably, we kind of always navigate into a lot of areas which we think are relevant for us. But as an editor, do you see that this is going to be a very noticeable shift in the perspective of writings which are going to be coming in?
I mean, I can only speak from my own perspective. I'm one editor among many, but it's a job that I gladly take on because I know for most poets, they are kind of imagining and articulating things that are not clearly given analytical categories in everyday discourse, and that deep imagining is very much to be valued. But in terms of, the theme of the Poetry Festival's resurgence, I think there is a sort of discernible and sort of growing need for a form of articulating ourselves through poetry that is not simply falling into existing categories. So it's not simply as a reflection of heritage, of roots, of predetermined categories, but a sort of going beyond. And I think the pandemic has made us aware of how fragile we are as not just bodies, but also in terms of how quickly our relationships can, fall apart when we're isolated, and that makes it all the more precious. And poetry is the medium that's both on the page and read and heard in person, as we've heard with all the wonderful readers this morning. And I think it's that idea of that preciousness of that reading and that listening in that moment that is going to, maybe have a little bit of a resurgence. Yeah. I'm hopeful.
Yeah. I mean, I was just conducting a panel talk with poetry festival directors across the world. And one of the festival directors actually very rightly put it, saying that it is poetry is like oxygen. And what we have inhaled and exhaled during these pandemic years are going to be recorded by poets for a very long time to come. And coming back to you, Esther, like you, when we are actually writing as a poet, and when you are sitting there as an editor, right? I mean, you are both a poet and an editor, both of you all, right? How do you shift between the two? And how does that understanding come, to look at another person's work and to see how they are, grappling with what is happening around? And I'm sure with a lot of these themes, you will still find a lot of elements of the pandemic coming in, or the resurgence coming in their work.
Thanks for that question, Shilpa. So I think as a poet and as an editor, it's really quite two different roles, right? I mean, as the poet, you are speaking from a place that comes from you, but isn't just your voice, because it also encompasses and is really the voices of others as well, and the environments that you are engaging with. I think as an editor, so your question was how do I shift between the two, right? So I think it is quite intuitive as well, because I do have let's say certain projects like the Tiger Moth. I do have time for myself. So I think whenever I feel like there's something that I need to say that needs to be written, there's this idea that that's come to me. Usually, let's say when I wake up, and certain dreams, because I do have quite vivid dreams, and I engage with my dreams quite a lot in dream work and in my meditation. So I would write it down, and then I would leave it aside, and I might return to it, when I feel that it wants to be returned to. Yeah, and I guess for the editorial work, I think that is more structured in some sense, because usually there is a timeline as well and a deadline, and there are certain things that need to be done. And shifting between the two, I think for me it's quite natural. I think I can actually toggle between the different roles quite naturally. I'm not sure about how this is for other editors and poets, but it does require that you take on a different role. I think it also makes you more empathetic, because you are an editor, but you also know how it feels like to receive a rejection as a writer. So I guess it does help to increase that kind of empathy. And I think it also feeds into the work, because then you're plugged into the kind of issues or concerns, that other writers are writing about. When you look at the work and you're like, oh, okay, so this is also something that I have engaged with, that I'm trying to deal with. And yeah, so I think it's quite complementary, I would say. As an editor, you're making space for other voices. As a poet, you are trying to be authentic and convey this kind of voice. Yeah. I hope that's...
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, thanks a lot for both those answers, because this is targeted towards a lot of people who are resorting to poetry to express what there is inside. There is so much which poetry can help you heal, to overcome, and, to move forward, right? Both of your collections have such spiritual elements. When you were speaking about, the turning over, about the aging process, right? The ecdysis of a fanged vestigial. I mean, that line was also, how much do we need to shed before we transcend, right? That element of spirituality just comes in. There is so much, even with Esther, right? There is this whole, you have actually put it into a section called pilgrims, right? It is like a pilgrimage where you go around and you traverse, and you find that within the human world, which we are all here, we do find that element of connection with whatever we are dealing with right now, right? And as a pilgrim, as a seeker, as a writer, all that comes in. So for all those who are writing right now, this kind of craft and this kind of poetry, which is layered and which has got a lot of elements of, the concrete as well as the abstract, which is woven in it, is what I think is very, very commendable. Both of your collections there. The poems are extremely good. Yeah, thank you. So coming back to the, the next question is that how do you actually, if you were to give an advice to, because these are new releases and there are a lot of people who are writing new, what is the kind of advice would you give to hone their craft, to come up with, to have the courage to come up with their collection? We just have Jonathan Chan written such a wonderful first collection there. And how do you encourage or advise people to come up with their first collections who are thinking about it? You want to go first?
I guess I can go first. I think there's a sort of assumption that links writing to publication. Mm-hmm. I think it's actually counterintuitive, but especially with poetry, I think waiting to publish actually offers more rewards. And that's where you hone your craft, because you give yourself time to step away from it. And stepping away from it also means allowing other readers to participate in your poetry. So reading it to friends or to fellow writers is part of honing that craft, because you're honing your own sense of listening and reading your own work. And sometimes you don't have that capacity. You have to grow that, and sometimes painfully. So I think give it time. That's my first piece of advice. And secondly, a poetry collection is very different from having a series of 15, 30 or 50 great poems in a row. It's a sort of different configuration altogether. And there has to be a sort of very deep integrity to a collection that only you as the writer can sort of thread through yourself. But it also means taking a good hard look at your craft and saying, well, this doesn't fit, and it's not there to print another page. You got to throw it. You got to be quite unsparing of yourself.
A bit brutal, right?
Yes,
You should be
that's right.
brutal about the whole
Yeah,
process, and
honest and
also
brutal.
be a bit more critical about what. Yes. Because if you have to say it, you make sure, because it's on print, you should say it the best way you can, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I really like what Anne said about, being patient. So I would say to be patient as well. And I completely agree that, with time, the work changes, you change. And, when you look back at your earlier poems and you look back at the poems written, in a more contemporary time, you can really see the growth as well. And so it does pay to really wait and to be patient. And I think just waiting for the right publisher, in a way, the publisher is the home, right? So I always feel that I'm so thankful that Blue Cactus Press is the home for my debut collection, Red Earth, because they have they are really just the best home in terms of how they're able to appreciate the work, how they treat the poems, and as well as the relationships that we have forged together, as like a community and not just a publisher and poet. Yeah, so I think that's so important. And I think for me, having time and space is also very important, because I actually had to take the time off and just focus on the mentorship. Like I found that I felt that my craft just was quite stagnant at that point in time, and I felt that I needed the mentorship of someone like Boy Kim Ching, for example, because I really like his poetics. And, so I think just knowing where you are and then knowing what you need is also quite important. And I wanted to also respond to your point about the spirituality in the work. So actually, I found that for me, poetry and spirituality really went hand in hand. So I was really doing a lot of meditation at that point in time, and I found that poetry was my meditation as well. Yeah, so I think for everyone, for every poet, it would be a different journey. But whatever it is still this kind of like self-realization and discovery and this journeying inwards in order for the work to then come forth, into the world, on print. Yeah.
So it's like a meditative process, right?
And the poems are themselves a meditation
Yes.
as well, for me, at least. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
If I can jump in, I think poetry is perhaps maybe the last genre that allows you to take such extreme risks with putting things in writing. I think prose is slightly different because of its duration.
Yeah.
But that's just, an aside.
Yeah. And I think poetry is more challenging because you need to condense a lot into a short page or something. So I should open the floor to questions in the audience. If anyone has any questions for you all, anything about the collection or where it is. Anything? Yeah.
How did you manage to write the poems about faraway places? Like, you trying to visit them yourself or something?
Okay, thanks for the question. Are you a current student at NUS High? Okay, so I'm teaching at NUS High. Thank you so much for coming down. Yeah, so I think for Red Earth, for at least the poems alluding to different places, definitely they were written after I had returned. And for me, poetry also is a way of returning to place. It is like what I like to describe as a third space. So every time every single moment is unique in itself, right? It will never ever return. And so I think writing the poems allowed me to recreate this and reimagine this space and then return to it again and again. And in reading the poems at different times, I also kind of return to a different sense of place within that created space. So I would have to go to the place first. And when I was actually there, let's say in different parts of the world, I did not actually think that these would become poems, So I was just really just fully immersing myself in place. And then when I returned many years later, so for some of the poems, they're written many years later. For others, they're more recent, like let's say 2 years later. But for others, it could be like 10 years or so. And if for like the first poem, for example, A Different Time in Dream Fruit, that would be like 20 years because I allude to my childhood. So definitely I think for me at least, I need to be in place and then leave and then return in my writing. Yeah, thank you for that question.
That's almost like again, coming back to that word pilgrim,
Yeah.
You you be there and you are just in that space at that point of time. You don't think anything beyond that.
Yeah.
But then you do not know how in subconscious it has entered your space, right?
Yeah.
And it comes out through poetry over a period of time. Yeah. Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other question before we wrap? Okay. So on that note, thanks a lot, Anne and Esther, for being here and sharing your work and your writing and your views on writing and your writing process. It is, I think, going forward, there is so much poetry which is going to happen, but good poetry is always, something, a joy to cherish and to read and come back to, right? It ignites the pilgrim in us, right? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Shilpa, for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to our audience online and in person as well for spending time with us today.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Poetry Festival Singapore, and see you all. We have next events lined up for the next. We have a poetry reading, Chinese poetry recitation coming up in the afternoon, and then there's the National Poetry Competition Prize Award Ceremony happening in the evening. So stay tuned. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.